I think it's pretty funny, right? Every election in your memory has also been the most important election of our lifetime, right? It seems that every single one is.
Well, every season of The Bachelorette is the most dramatic in history, too. But
Obviously.
it never really is. We have very different viewpoints on many things.
But a lot of these issues are American issues. They're not Republican or Democrat issues.
Well, Mike, we've reached part 4 of our Could 9/11 Happen Again mini docu-series. We've gone from the Soviet-Afghan War and the rise of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and it's in part 1, to part 2, where we covered the attacks themselves and the response that the United States government had. And then we had a wonderful interview with Mr. Michael Morell, the former acting director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And today, we plan to put a fine point on the conversations we've had, fill in some of the gaps that might still exist, and really bring it home to, could this happen again today? So, Mike, to really quickly recap, what were your takeaways from the first episode you did, or we did, on the Soviet-Afghan War and the rise of Al-Qaeda?
Sure. So I always love the nuance in the stories, right? The devil's in the details, and when you start to look into the more granular parts of it, it really highlights the important points of that. Osama bin Laden was not directly funded by the CIA, so he's not somebody we created, but it was certainly an environment that we helped create that would eventually lead to his rise. And then more importantly, not doing enough early on throughout the couple decades of his involvement to put a stop to the rise of Al-Qaeda, and really not paying attention to them as an emerging threat. And as we'll get to later in the episode, it is still an evolving and relevant threat today.
Yeah, so it's funny because a lot of the conspiracy theorists have watched our last episode and said, oh, you didn't press the CIA director hard enough. And actually, what you just said is exactly what I was going to bring up, is those conspiracy theorists where the CIA funded Osama bin Laden, they are based in some level of truth, where the CIA did give money to the fighting forces of the Mujahideen, where he was fighting for. But the problem is, that's when he broke away after that and then became a terrorist organization. And the CIA had nothing to do with that. They had everything to do with stopping that. So I think we can consider that debunked. There's no CIA funding to Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. That is a very weird one. So
the thing is, I find is, especially through all the readings of this, and then even speaking with Michael Morell, is they're very upfront about what they can talk about. They're quite proud of it, right? I can imagine if I was a member in the community having to stay, sealed lip about all these things. If it becomes declassified, I'd love to talk about it. A little relevant. The thing is, I'm friends with a defense contractor who's a drone operator, and back in our World of Warcraft days, right, he would disappear on some nights, and we'd always wonder where he'd go, and we'd ask him, and he's like, I can't talk about it unless it becomes a headline in the news in the morning, and then it's public, and then I can, so it's just it goes to speak about the hard-working men and women in the community. They're not even just the CIA, all the intelligence community agencies. They're not these rogue agents, right? I think that they're working hard to protect Americans, and they're trying to follow the rules that we give them. And I think a lot of those failures that we looked at through those episodes are really failures of our ability to either give them the resources they needed or set appropriate policies.
Well, as Mr. Morell explained, it's so difficult when you don't have time, the place, and the method of carrying out these attacks. And those are the key details that they were unfortunately lacking. They had the presence of mind in the Middle East there to say, we're not going to share those details. So from 1993, the bombing at the World Trade Center, the embassy bombings in Kenya in 98, and then all the way to 2000, the USS Cole bombing, I don't think it would be fair at all to say the CIA or the FBI ignored these warnings, right? What we've been hearing is, they were constantly raising the alarm. So if anything, you have to kind of tip your hat to the intelligence communities in this story, in this respect, when it comes to 9/11.
Absolutely. There were definitely missteps along the way. They acknowledged that. You could see that both with Mike Morell and other FBI agents, things like that. But I like the kind of the cap that he put on it. It was really a national failure, right? Because this happened during the Clinton election, and then there were problems that happened after Bush was elected. So it was not just a one-person problem. I don't like using blame instead of accountability. Accountability means that you're finding the source point of the failure, and a lot of times it's not the individual that's involved, but it's the policies and a culture that creates that kind of a situation.
Yeah, well, that brings us to honestly a great point: is could it happen again today? And with all of those tie-overs, for example, we'll start from what you just said. drama in the politics, drama in changing the party that's coming in. The old candidate is being pointed at and potentially impeached, or maybe the new candidate is, right? So all of this turmoil turning over executive orders that we already know is going to happen if any candidate comes in. All of these changes are going to happen. All of the previous administration's goals and objectives are basically going to be thrown out. And now we're in an environment where our FBI, I'd like to read a quote. Our FBI just said this in March when ISIS-K, who we're going to get to in a little bit as a burgeoning threat, they had a successful attack in Moscow in March. And Christopher Wray went on the record at that time and warned us, quote, "The potential for a coordinated attack on U.S. soil is increasingly concerning. As I look back over my career in law enforcement, I'm hard-pressed to come up with a time when I've seen so many different threats, all elevated, all at the same time." So, I mean, if that doesn't ring true to exactly what Mike Morell was explaining, he was writing it in the President's Daily Brief, he was sharing it with Condi Rice, he was sharing it with the ODNI and National Security Council. We have this today. It's happening right now, today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think it's up to 15 terror attacks were thwarted that were planned on the Olympic events by French authorities, but also in cooperation with the many other intelligence communities throughout Europe. And I'm sure the U.S. played a part in that as well. The U.S. and European allies have close cooperation there. But there was a terror attack, as you mentioned, in Moscow, as well as one in Iran, and about 250 people, I believe, were killed between those two incidents, and many more wounded. Those threats were shared with those countries from the U.S., right? So even though Iran and Russia not exactly our friends right now, we still tried to share those threats with them, and it still speaks to the challenges that we face today. So in a post 9/11 in an immediate post 9/11 environment, many countries around the world had increased their intelligence sharing and capabilities and things of that nature. We're kind of seeing a rolling back of that cooperation now. There was some, glimmer of hope between, I think it was 2014 and 2017, when ISIS-K was, an emerging threat again. I think it was up to 87 countries, very strange bedfellows, had come together, cooperated to tamp down them as a threat. But we're seeing some of the pre-9/11 conditions, as well as some of those conditions that led to ISIS, rising back up from the grave, is we're allowing safe havens for them. We're, unfocused on our strategies right now. And it's not because we want to, it's just there are just too many pressing threats. You're dealing with Russia-Ukraine, Israel-Hamas conflict, and then there's issues in South China Sea and China ratcheting up tensions there. And to your point as well, we have a lot of political distractions, be it the political violence or just policy disagreements and things like that. So it is so important that whoever the party takes over in the next year, there's some continuity of government, and they really address this threat that is emerging, because when we let our guard down, that's exactly what's going to happen.
Well, what you said with how many things are going on in the world in terms of foreign affairs and global conflicts, of course the United States is going to be overwhelmed. You'd think that, we have another conflict, we have to build out a whole other department to monitor this and to stay on top of the intelligence that's coming out of that region. And when we heard from Mikey, right, which was the moniker given to Mr. Morell by George W. himself, it was that there's only so much you could fit in a day. I mean, he said that he would wake up at 4 a.m. to show up, or something like 4 a.m. to show up at work at 5, maybe even 3 a.m. to show up at work at 4, before his President's Daily Brief at 8. And then after 9/11, he would wake up at 12:30, that's midnight, to be in the office by 1:30, to work 8 hours to prep for this President's Daily Briefing. So even with just that amount of human effort, it's basically the top level of what a human is capable of. But even then, you can't brief one person, one team. It's just not possible. So that's another thing that's been going on. This spread of all the different things that we need to keep our eye on. And I think that harkens back to what Christopher Wray was saying is, well, once again, we don't have the budget for this. We know it's going on,
exactly,
but we can't keep our finger on the pulse of it. So, I mean, Mike, why don't you talk to me a little bit about how you perceive the reason that we would pull back on our intelligence community in the country at this time? Why would we have such a huge thing happen in 2001? We increase our capabilities by fourfold, if I remember correctly. And then over the last couple of years, this has been tuned back and tuned back and tuned back. Why would we do that when we're at such a heightened level of conflict?
I really do think it's complacency. It's a matter of when conflicts happen over there, they're very tragic and we become very concerned. But when you don't have unfortunately, if you don't have a recent attack in memory, it fades from your attention. And we spoke about this in our 9/11 documentary in the first three parts. We come from that generation where we were just old enough to really have some strong conscious memories of that. But even just people who are a few years younger than us might not have understood at all what was happening at the time and wouldn't until years later. So if you ask the current generation who are just becoming, legal adults, they actually have no memories whatsoever of 9/11. And without such memories, like I said, you become complacent and you focus on what you feel are the most important policy, decisions that need to be made right now. But it's a universal one, national security. It's not, it's something you need to be vigilant for, and it's never something that you want to fix after the fact, right? You want to prevent these attacks from happening. And it really speaks to the trickle-down effect of this, right? So our divided politics doesn't let us, come up with immigration compromise and solutions to that. Part of that article that had recently just come out in Foreign Affairs Today, that's, all the red lights on terrorism warnings are blinking again. 8 Tajik nationals were caught trying to cross the U.S. southern border who had links to ISIS-K. So as much as someone who is very adamantly pro-immigration and wants reasonable and rational immigration policies, not necessarily a full citizenship model, but something has to be done here because other organizations who wish to do harm to the United States realize these vulnerabilities there. So the longer we disagree about this and we focus on not fixing it, it is a problem that only grows over time.
Yeah, well, hey, I like to acknowledge the shortcomings of the Republican Party as much as I can so I can remain balanced in my own perception, at least. Trump wanted to address the border crisis and, in my opinion, fell short of doing that. He began to construct sections of wall. He began to be tough in the rhetoric to keep these folks from coming over illegally. And I think that he made some headway, but I think that he fell drastically short. That's one of his main promises going into this new campaign, and I think that he's learned some lessons and he'll make it a big priority, especially because of what we're talking about now. But with that said, the Biden administration specifically overturned executive orders. They specifically didn't address the border and basically, I'm going to say, gaslit the American people to say, it's not happening, this is the right thing to do. And something I was writing on X this week was, well, if they let through, some estimates say 11 million, some estimates say up to 15 million illegal immigrants came over that southern border during that term. It only took 19, not 19 million, 19 people to carry off the 9/11 attacks. So how on earth do you think, if we're saying we caught 8 coming across, so that could have thwarted 8 airplanes crashing into 8 different buildings? Because when you look at what we've studied here, it really only takes one person to fly that airplane. Well, they had muscle and all of that, but right, the point remains, you said it best, Mike. When you're a police officer, the criminals have to keep getting away with it, but the police officer, to catch them, only has to get lucky once.
Right.
The terrorist only has to get lucky once. They only have to get through there.
So it's acknowledged by the intelligence communities and law enforcement agencies that there are thousands of individuals in the United States who are part of these terrorist cells and wish to do harm to Americans. They're the logistical support, right? So these 8 Tajik nationals who were captured, they had contacts with ISIS-K, individuals who would provide them the money and the means to access the weapons or materials they wish to do to conduct these attacks. And it speaks to the danger of it because they weaponize our empathy and they weaponize our free speech systems, right? So they kind of this entrepreneurial model, as it was described, to where they will even, if you can come up with your own methods that fit within their radicalization and ideology, they'll support your attack. So it's these lone wolf attacks, right, that we saw with the Boston Marathon bombing, something similar to that are really the most dangerous and the hardest to combat. I don't want to say let's lock down every social media and internet platform and control the free speech, but there, like I said, there has to be some sort of compromise to address these concerns, because this is not free speech. This is inciting hate and terror attacks, right? I mean, I hope we can agree that they're two separate things here. But yeah, it's not just necessarily those individuals who get in, right? There's already thousands here, and every other one that does get in could be more logistical support for these future attacks. And once they reach that critical point, maybe they can conduct an operation to our detriment.
Yeah, well, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, wow, yeah, if they have this model where they say, reach out to us, we'll hook you up with weapons, money, means, that obviously shows you that they have sleeper cells here in the States that are ready and willing to make these things happen. They just need you know, the willing idiot to carry it out, I guess, right? Because that's the one
Right,
that's not
right.
coming home. The
Yeah.
people in charge, they know that they will get home. And actually, Mike, there was some news that came out really relevant to all of our series regarding KSM. Can you tell us who that is and what you recall about what we read?
Sure. So, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, right, the
Yep.
mastermind behind the 9/11 plots, and two other individuals were given a plea deal today. But just so everyone's clear, it was not like a plea deal so they get released, right? They're accepting a plea deal on charges. They will be serving multiple life sentences for the deaths of up to 3,000 Americans on that event that day. Um, it really stands as an example of how complex the legal pitfalls and challenges there are to prosecuting even what you believe to be a pretty set in stone kind of case for an individual who is very proud of what they did and were promising such attacks before they happened, and were involved with all the individuals who provided such logistical support. So it really kind of challenges some of my beliefs, but at the end of the day, I almost believe like a death sentence would have been too easy for them, right? I mean, isn't that their ultimate goal, is to become a martyr and ascend to heaven as a reward for everything you've done? So I think a lifetime on earth of thinking about what he's done is probably a better punishment.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed involved in the 93 World Trade Center original bombings as well?
So he was he was a plotter in that, and then he was the uncle of the nephew who engaged the plot, right? So it was his idea of this Bojinka plot of using multiple airliners, pre 9/11, and that operation would eventually kind of be reformulated and become the 9/11 operation. So this guy is a terror mastermind, and a very committed individual that, if he was free, would absolutely be plotting very sophisticated attacks on Americans and their allies throughout the world. And it's so important to understand that the motivations of these people are not just simply because the West has become involved in the Middle East. Their aspirations are beyond the Middle East. I cannot make this clear enough. It's not just a matter of that we have disagreements of things. They wish to establish a global caliphate. At a certain point, America can withdraw and isolate and accede to their demands, but ultimately their demands will be global domination in some way. And you might think that that's some ragtag fighters in the desert or some far-flung country in Central Asia. Now, how are they going to do it? It doesn't matter if they can do it. It's the terror and the damage that they'll do along the way, and the disruptions to what we know is our way of life, right? So that's their goal, is terror and disrupting that.
Well, it goes to something that I mentioned only in like one sentence of the interview with Mike Morell, and it's the four letters that stand for a multi-domain operating environment, or an MDOE, and that's how modern warfare is fought. The weaker that the United States is, the stronger that ISIS-K perceives themselves to be, and that's exactly what I think we see. And how happy would you be if you were a leader of Russia or China or North Korea or Iran, and you said, look at those Americans. They are really screwing up. They're infighting. They can't pick a president. They got citizens shooting at their presidential candidates, right? Whether or not that was motivated is yet to be found by those foreign bank accounts they discovered on crooks. But the truth is that this infighting. This is what's totally, totally killing us. And actually, this is a great time, Mike. We're going to tease that next week we're going to have on Jeremy Adams, an author who wrote an awesome book. There you go. Yep. And we're reading it right now, Lessons in Liberty, where it's kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, but right, his central theme is we're all Americans. We need to come together. Everybody's flawed. Everybody has these issues. And excuse me, you're probably further along in the book than me at this point. But right, he shares lessons about all the flaws of our past great leaders, starting off with George Washington, but how those flaws made those great people, and or made those people great. And that's why it's such an interesting concept. We're all Americans here. You're left wing, I'm right wing. We have very different viewpoints on many things, but we know at the end of the day we're Americans, and the alternative is to be this weak infighting country that gets taken advantage of by all of these other, dare I call them, axes in the world stage. And that's where I think we have this open door, this blind spot. Our intelligence community is blinking the light red.
Yeah. Listen, these are not right threats or left problems, right? They're American issues that we all need to come together and find common ground on. A lot of the stories are incredibly inspiring, and it's funny because you learn about these individuals and their incredible stories, and then that's just the way history works. And your short attention span is you forget about them. Daniel Inouye, the senator and the representative, and the Marine. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe he was in the Army on that, but just a service member of the United States. Just has this storied past, and it's somebody who was a Japanese American who was put in an intern camp, right? So he suffered all of this discrimination, but it never shook his faith in belief in the American ideal and American exceptionalism. And I think it's so important to realize that you need to have that kind of patriotism and change the system from within, right? So all of these problems and concerns that both parties raise are issues, but we need to work together to solve them as Americans, because the global threats are growing. And it's not that the United States needs to be the world police force anymore, but our primacy in the world creates a very safe environment that we've enjoyed for many decades, and it's being challenged. And as I said, it's not that the U.S. needs to be involved everywhere at once, but it speaks to the need of not just cooperating as a nation, but really like these Western liberal values, not American liberal, but just the liberal democracies that we enjoy so much, right? The free speech, free enterprise, and things of that nature. They truly are under threat, and the more we divide amongst ourselves, the less prepared we are to deal with that.
Yes, maybe I'll call them federalist beliefs in this way.
Sure.
Well, I will say, Mike, I asked you in the beginning of episode 1, hey, I'm seeing all these threats. I'm seeing heightened warnings for foreign embassies. I'm seeing the attacks going off, and the director of the FBI ringing the alarm. And I said, hey, make me feel better. And you immediately shook your head and said, oh, no, I can't do that because this is a problem. I think that what we've done here is very important because, like you were saying, people don't necessarily remember this anymore. But when you look at the cogs of our system, you have Khalid Sheikh Mohammed sitting in Guantanamo Bay, presumably for over 20 years, or maybe 15 years, but carrying out terrorism for more than 30 years. And just now, the United States lawyers have reached a plea deal where they take death off of the table. This is unimaginable to me. And then the alternative is he gets charged with 3,000 murders. It just totally makes no sense. And actually, to me, this is yet another failure on this topic. Because, what? 30 years?
Right. No, I mean, it's incredible that this guy has been around on this earth doing what he's done so long. Again, I don't necessarily believe in the death penalty now that we have the guy arrested, but at the same time, it really speaks to how you disrupt the need to disrupt these operations. I mean, these people are willing to commit their lives to the cause of taking as many American and Western lives as possible, so these are not people that could be reasoned with or rationed with, right? Even the Taliban is more pragmatic than these people, as we've come to learn. They're not the best people, but they at least will, not commit to acts of terror as these people do. And again, it's not the United States that's just their target. It's anyone who's, vaguely and aligned with us. So it really does speak to this being an international problem as well.
Now, actually, correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't it the Taliban that was in Afghanistan at the time of the uprising of Al-Qaeda, and they basically said, no, we're not going to give them to you?
Right, so that's how this all kicked off. Is they were, I actually think it was a good point. I forget which book I read it from. Maybe it was Michael Morell's book, but this wasn't like state-sponsored terror, right? Like this wasn't Afghanistan sponsored. This was a terrorist-sponsored state because the governance was so weak in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was paying rent to the Taliban at the time to operate there and open up training camps, right? So it was, it again addresses the challenges of trying to prevent those safe havens, and then you're going to need operating environments that are nearby. That was why our alliance and coordinations with Pakistan was so important. But today, at least, Taliban is trying to do a very good job of fighting ISIS. There are different analysts who will say how effective their techniques are. But one of the best abilities of ISIS is to operate in the seams between these great powers, right? So they create these divisions and they operate in the blind spots and find themselves breathing room to grow and present themselves as, you know, threats in the future.
What I was going to posit was, if they did it back then and harbored the terrorism, why, or terrorists, why wouldn't they do it now? Right? Presumably we were pulled out, or we did pull out and left the Taliban in charge back when I guess that was 2020, 2021 or something along those lines. And now they've been running the country. So why? We don't have eyes on the ground. What is Biden's policy called? The over the horizon. And we're reading their cables, but we have no idea. And I guess ISIS-K is more southern based in Tajikistan, but like, of course they're in the mountains in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Of course. Like, this is crazy to me. This is crazy.
So that was part of the condition of the withdrawal, right? Is, listen, Taliban, we're going to let you have control back of the country so long as you promise not to provide safe haven to these terrorists and cooperate with us. And again, there's mixed, analysis on whether their exact tactics are effective. It seemed to have ramped down some of the attacks over time, but the thing about ISIS is that they just change their tactics and they evolve over time. They really are this amorphous, nefarious organization. And they will just operate in other countries and other areas and with other organizations as well to achieve their goals. So it really does speak to who you have to make bedfellows with to combat terrorism. Terrorism is a threat to everybody, right? So it's not a happy alliance to be working with the Taliban, but I think most people can agree that we don't want to see a 9/11 style attack, and even something short of that is still pretty heinous.
Well, I mean, actually, now that we say that, we're thinking of terrorism as United States-based attacks, but it goes much deeper than that. And you might even say, wow, they've actually carried out numerous attacks in Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is where they're being harbored, potentially. So that is showing that they don't care for anybody, right? They're their own independent problem here. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was, do you feel, so after 9/11, we had this revelation that the CIA and the FBI had to work closely together, or more closely, and the ODNI was put into place. And what happened was this more free flow of intelligence and sharing. Now it sounds like we're doing that not only internally in the United States, but we're doing this globally. Sure. I potentially, because I am one of those that has kind of lower faith in institutions, especially in the intelligence community. We've seen over the last couple of years a big target on the back of MAGA extremists, in some cases warranted, in many cases not. But I sometimes feel that if we're sharing all of this intel globally, and like we said, we even talked to Russia and Iran to try to thwart attacks. Of course, that's very noble of us, but is it possible that this is also a negative thing, and maybe we're being taken advantage of by being the best, by being the strongest, by being the smartest? Everyone is going to say, well, give us your info, give us your intel, and maybe there are some bad actors that are going to turn around and use it against us. The way that the means of delivery or the means of collection, all of that kind of stuff. Mike Morell couldn't tell us about how they do that, but now we're sharing that information with Russia in some kind of way. So do you see any writing on the wall in that, or you see it as a beneficial overall good?
It's a mixed bag, right? So you can never trust the motivations of somebody else, and you just hope that they are doing the right thing, and hopefully their actions speak for themselves. That certainly was a concern when you coordinate with certain organizations pre 9/11, right? Unreliable actors may use that information to the detriment of the United States. Al-Bayoumi is an interesting character, Saudi Arabia has been an ally to the United States in a lot of counterterrorism operations and just military operations in that region, circa the Gulf War. The issue lies with Bayoumi is that he had ties to the intelligence organization in Saudi Arabia, right? So he wasn't like a direct agent or asset that we know of, but he knew lots of individuals and seemed to have at least been some sort of informant, at least to them. So this speaks to the complexities of it. What do? You cut off all relations with Saudi Arabia. Arguably they're the most important, nation in the region. They're the leader of that particular Muslim sect of the world, and that's 90% of the population. So there's no real strategy moving forward without coordinating with them.
Yeah, well, I was talking to someone today about the United States and how we think in terms of 4 years or 8 years. And it's very possible that Saudi Arabia, I don't know their lineage of their rulers, but it's likely that they have much longer terms and they have much longer
There's no
continuity of
terms.
government. That's my point,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So it's the same person who's in rule, like Russia, is probably 20 plus years. So they get to
Yeah,
enact
it is,
these
yeah.
long-term plans. And hey, I remember George W. Bush was assuring Putin back in, I think, 2004 that he was going to be let into NATO. And that never obviously happened. And now look at where we are. It's almost a complete 180 of what's happened. So it's very interesting to think that, some of these folks could potentially get in bed with us and become our, knocking elbows. But all of a sudden, now they've done that for nefarious reasons. They've planted the seeds at the highest level to then turn it around on us. And I guess I will say, despite what my following is going to say on X, I think it's a good thing. I think that we need to have the intelligence community and guys like Chris Wray, who are calling it out right now, despite this fact that they're saying we need FISA warrants and everybody's kind of raising the flag and saying, hey, there are pitfalls to this. I believe that those intelligence community members need those rights and they need that ability to keep us safe. And I would say, as an American citizen, if I'm looking up dumb stuff, that's on me. I'm not looking up dumb stuff, so come get me. Come look at me. Maybe
so
that's a stupid foible. But
So that's the grand compromise in our civics, right? And that's why civic participation is so important. And it's not just going out and vote, but just being apathetic to all the issues lets the government decide policies without you, right? So this is the problem when we have low voter participation, is that a minority of people are speaking for the majority. But again, we can agree that these are important policies, the whole FISA amendments and things like that. If people were well informed about what the programs do, and we have an honest conversations about what limitations we feel that should be on them, then we move forward and we make what hopefully should be successful policy. When we don't even address the issues, we're just kind of throwing caution to the wind and hoping what we're doing is the right thing and hoping that later Americans aren't upset about these. So. All of our intelligence communities, right? They're not these rogue actors. They have to adhere and operate to the policies that we give them and authorizations granted from them by Congress and authorization by the president. So it really does fall on some element of national unity. Again, we could disagree about certain components of our policies, but a lot of these issues are American issues. They're not Republican or Democrat issues. National security is a common ground that we should all be able to address and deal with, together.
So you and I have both been calling that Joe Biden's going to drop out of the race, and most of the world was calling that, and we were all correct. And Mike, you and I, we were on the right side when we knew that it was going to be Kamala Harris that took the presumptive nomination. And of course, that's what ended up happening. So now that we've had such a strong track record of what we think is going to happen, I'm curious what you think might happen over the next few months. We've already seen an assassination attempt on one of the candidates. Of course, with all of this tumultuity, we are only going to become more vulnerable. So, right, we're in August. That leaves September, October, and the very first week of November. If someone's going to do something, the door, I would say, is wide open. I'm curious what you think about that, and if you agree with, I believe that something will happen.
I think Secret Service is ramping, operations up to an 11 after what happened. I think they're dealing with the seriousness.
Well, that's protecting a presidential nominee, but I don't know if that's protecting buildings in Lower Manhattan or.
Sure. All right, so you're talking about like a national threat to us.
We're very distracted, is my point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. On domestic, yeah, our focus and attention right now is domestic, and it's only going to get more so as we get closer to selection, and both parties are saying it's for the soul of the country, it's for saving democracy. So, I think it's pretty funny, right? Every election in your memory has also been the most important election of our lifetime, right? It seems that every single one is.
Well, every season of The Bachelorette is the most dramatic in history, too. But
obviously.
It never really is.
Sure. So as we get closer to November, the focus is going to be on that. this is what speaks to the continuity of government, and this is why it's important to have careered bureaucrats and operational and analysts in the background, who do these things regardless of who's going to be president. So hopefully they're dealing with these threats. I am concerned just going in generally the next few months, because ISIS, it really doesn't matter what the day of the election are. They're plotting and will wait until the most vulnerable moment they think is to strike. So, just any candidate that gets in office needs to really address terrorism as a component of threat strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as November passes and the lame president is sitting in the seat and the presumptive candidate or the elected nominee is going to come in before January, I remember Mike Morell was telling us how involved he was personally with working with George W. Bush and all that. So whether it's Kamala, I'm sure she's in on some of these briefings already that's going on, which I personally believe it will be Kamala. But if it's Trump, then obviously the folks that are in CIA are going to be sitting with him for months and months and saying, here's what you missed out on the last 4 years, and here's what we're really concerned about. And
Right.
I guess people like you and me, we can only say, wow, I really hope he takes those threats seriously and he puts forward the big stick, right, which is probably the best
Absolutely.
way to prevent stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I 100% and wholeheartedly agree. So either president, whoever it might be, needs to definitely focus this as a strategy on their strategy moving forward.
Well, Mike, I mean, this was quite a learning experience for me. I can't thank you enough for going thousands, not an exaggeration, not hundreds, thousands of hours of reading over this stuff over years and years. But just the effort we've put in over the last couple of weeks here to put out this series, I'm really proud of it. I hope our listeners really enjoyed it. Again, if you haven't watched parts 1, 2, and 3, this was a little summary, but you will become an encyclopedia of how we got to that point, what actually happened at 9/11, and a lot of our listeners maybe weren't alive at that time because I was only in the 4th grade when it happened, and then what we're struggling or grappling with now. So we probably covered a lot of themes like FISA, or certain things that you don't even know what we were talking about, but those are stuff where if you go back even further, we definitely touched on those. But Mike, thank you. Seriously, this was an awesome time. And thank you to Mike Morell, the former CIA director. And thank you to Spencer Schecht, our colleague, who is another 9/11, I don't want to use the wrong word, not a fanatic, right? Very much interested in all of the everything 9/11. So thank you to you all. This has been Could 9/11 Happen Again? And Mike, I think with the answer we're going to provide is a resounding, unfortunately so. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely looming on the horizon. It's something we need to pay attention to.
And that's why this is so important, guys. So with that, this has been Elevated Thoughts.